Welcome back to our series on undesigned coincidences between the New Testament Gospels that give us confidence that these Gospels contain accurate eyewitness information from people who were very close to the events. Next, let's look at some cases where John's Gospel explains the Synoptic Gospels. There are several undesigned coincidences around the event of the feeding of the 5,000 men. First, before the miracle, Mark's Gospel mentions at 6:31 that many people were coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. This seems a little strange. Elsewhere, many people would come to hear Jesus, but why were they also going, sounding like they were in the middle of a busy transit area? John's Gospel explains in 6:4 that the miracle happened right before the Passover. This explains the situation, because at that time there would be hundreds of thousands of Jews traveling to Jerusalem for the Passover festival, including many coming down through that part of Galilee. Next, comparing the accounts from all four of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John all mention the grass that the people sat down on, which is an interesting detail. And John says there was much grass in that place. Mark specifically mentions that the grass was green. Now, in some parts of the world, that doesn't seem unusual because our grass is always green. Perhaps we have water sprinkler systems for our lawns and fertilizer and so on. But in that part of the world, the grass was usually brown and dead-looking, not green. That's why there are so many metaphors in the Bible, such as Psalms and Isaiah and James, comparing things to grass as being temporary. But there is one time of the year when the grass was green in Galilee, and that was right after the spring rains, which was also the time of the Passover festival. So this is another undesigned coincidence that John mentions that this miracle happened around Passover, and Mark mentions that the grass was green at that time. Here's another interlocking. John mentions in 6:5 that Jesus specifically asked his disciple Philip where they should buy food for the thousands of people. But why Philip? He's not one of the more prominent disciples like Peter or James. He was not the treasurer of the group, who was Judas Iscariot. Philip is only mentioned 3 other times in the Gospels in a conversation, all 3 of those times in the Gospel of John. There were other disciples standing there, as we see Andrew suggesting an idea in verse 8. So why did Jesus ask Philip? Well, we learned from Luke chapter 9 that this miracle took place near the city of Bethsaida. And if we go to a different section of John's Gospel, chapter 1, completely unrelated to this story in chapter 6, we learn that Philip was from Bethsaida. So if we put these 3 pieces of information together, 2 from different parts of John's Gospel and 1 from Luke's Gospel, now it makes more sense why Jesus asked Philip about the bread. Philip was the local guy from Bethsaida who would be expected to know the best people to buy lots of bread from. Of course, Jesus already knew that he was going to do this miracle, but this helps us understand why Philip was asked. This is quite an undesigned coincidence, requiring 3 pieces to solve the puzzle. If the authors had been making this detail up, so they would have been more clear about how these pieces fit together, so no one would miss it. But instead, since they were just relating eyewitness details, the pieces fit together like a puzzle, as testimony often does from different eyewitnesses. Here are 2 more related to the feeding of the 5,000. Matthew records Jesus pronouncing woes on the unrepentant cities where he had done miracles in chapter 11, such as the cities of Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Chorazin. Matthew records plenty of miracles that were done in Capernaum, but doesn't specifically connect any miracles to Bethsaida or Chorazin. But as we saw, Luke chapter 9 says that the feeding of the 5,000 occurred near Bethsaida. So that interlocks here and makes sense of why Jesus rebuked Bethsaida for refusing to repent. And one more. Have you ever wondered how they got the estimated count of 5,000 men? Matthew says there were about 5,000 men who ate, besides women and children. Mark and Luke mention that Jesus had his disciples get groups of about 50 or 100 to sit down, which helps us see how the size could be estimated fairly well by counting the groups. But John explains more specifically. Jesus said for the people to sit down, which is the Greek word anthropos, but it was mainly the men, Greek word andres, who sat down. This makes sense because the children were probably running around and the women were free to walk around and care for their children while the men received the food and then distributed it to their families. So that is how the other Gospels correctly related the count of 5,000 men, because it was the men who were seated in groups of 50s or 100s, not the women and children. The details of all this have to be carefully put together from all 4 Gospels to see how this worked, providing another undesigned coincidence in how they casually confirm each other as eyewitness testimony does.